How you guys doing?
Yeah.
Met a lot of you guys today, so that's good. Just to start things off, we traditionally just read a couple of verses of the Quran. So I request Bilal to accept.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم لا إكراه في الدين قد تبين الرشد من الغي فمن يكفر بالطاغوت ويؤمن بالله فقد استمسك بالعروة الوثقى لا انفصام لها والله سميع عليم. Translation. There should be no compulsion in religion. Surely right has become distinct from wrong. So whosoever refuses to be led by those who transgress and believes in Allah, he surely has grasped a strong handle which knows no breaking. And Allah is all hearing, all knowing.
Thank you. First thing I want to do, just like I said, thank you guys for being here. Just to introduce myself, my name is Sharif, and I'm a fellow Nova student along with Jamaat. Me, along with the team we have here, we've been trying to set this up for a couple of weeks now. And we will have events like this in the future, and hopefully it'll be, that you're proud of that. As far as the campaign goes, we've been running this campaign as far as the Ahmadiyya Muslim Youth Association. We've been running this campaign across America, across Canada, around local schools, universities, colleges. And the first thing, there's a couple things on the initiatives. First thing is to fight youth radicalization. Second is to combat the ideologies that ISIS carries, that the Taliban, the list goes on, Al-Qaeda, to combat those ideologies with true Islamic teachings. So if we can, and like I said to a lot of you guys before, we have our Imam Sahib from our local mosque, so I can request him to come up here and say a few words. Actually, before that, we'll actually go to a video we had. So earlier, I said that radicalization was a phenomenon that was new to us in the West and in the US, and it's something we haven't seen before. So upon further reflection, is this really true? And we have a video set up just to, just for information.
On July 27, 2008, an enraged gunman walked the halls of Tennessee Valley Unitarian Universalist Church before taking a 12-gauge shotgun out of his guitar case and opening fire on an audience of 200 people watching a children's play. 58-year-old Jim Atkinson said he was motivated by a hatred of liberals, Democrats, and homosexuals. He was an extremist whose ideology of hate led to this act of terror. On April 19, 1995, terror and panic gripped the nation when Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols carried out a carefully crafted bombing of the Alfred P. Murray Federal Office Building in Oklahoma City.
The explosion shook central Oklahoma, killed nearly 170 people and injured more than 400 others. And it forever altered our sense of security and innocence.
They detonated a truck carrying more than 4,800 pounds of explosives. The explosion killed 169 people, injuring 700 more, and either destroying or damaging 324 buildings within a 16-block radius. Victims, including 3 pregnant women, ranged in age from 3 months to 73 years. The extremist anti-government views of the attackers led to this vicious act of terrorism, which forever lives in infamy. A quiet lunch at a full Louis cafeteria in Clinton, Texas, came to an abrupt end on October 16, 1991. 35-year-old George Jojo Kennard drove his pickup truck through the cafe's front window. Exiting the truck, Kennard then opened fire, unleashing a rampage that killed 23 people and injured 20 more. This former military man was known not only for being an unhappy loner, but also for his intense hatred towards women, and even during the attack screaming, "All women are clean and belted the vipers." On January 24, 1975, Puerto Rican extremist nationalist group known as the FALN bombed the Francis Tavern in New York City, killing 4 people and injuring more than 50 others. From 1974 to 1983, the FALN was responsible for more than 120 bomb attacks in the United States. In reality, we've seen extremism many times in our history, which carries forward till today in what feels like an unending string of shootings at schools and public facilities. Extremism is manifested in every generation in different ways and under various circumstances. Ultimately, it is not a matter of religion at all. Religion has nothing to do with it. Every time, it has been due to the actions of misguided individuals who are just frustrated with the world as they understood it.
If I can request Imam Rizwan Saad, and like I said, he's our Imam at our local mosque in Chantilly, so we'll say a few words.
أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. This campaign that the Ahmadiyya Muslim community is doing of Stop the Crisis is something that is common, I think, to everyone who is an American. But one of the reasons why it's important that we as the Ahmadiyya Muslim community are doing it is because a question that arises a lot in the minds of people here in the United States is that we know that we all condemn the actions of ISIS, of these extremist groups. But some people want to know that where are the Muslims? Where are the Muslim majority? The quiet Muslims, the moderate Muslims, why are they not speaking out against it? And so one of the reasons why we are doing this campaign is to let everyone know that the quiet Muslim majority is not really so quiet. It's just that the moderate Muslim majority simply does not get that same coverage because obviously we're not doing things that are as exciting or as headline worthy as the extreme things that terrorists are doing. So the objective we have in this campaign is to find a common solution to radicalization that is taking place in the world, to extremism that's taking place in the world. And the first step that we can take to getting rid of radicalization is understanding what its source is, understanding what the root cause of radicalization is. Now, there's a lot of perceptions about what the cause of radicalization is, extremism. And one of the perceptions that we may have in our mind, whether it's because of the media or whether it's because of other types of propaganda or anything that we've been exposed to, but a general impression is that radicalization and terrorism is something that's related to Islam. Now, when we hear the word Muslim and Islam in the news, it's often accompanied with the words terrorist or an Islamic extremist or a bombing or something like that. And that has a subtle effect on us. Even people who are Muslims are in a way subtly affected by this type of exposure that we have. So this is not something that's just affects people who are non-Muslims, it even affects Muslims. A person can actually slowly become subconsciously biased against their own people by being repeatedly exposed to that propaganda. It's even found that people can become racist against their own race too if they're repeatedly exposed to propaganda against their own race. So this is not something that is just the problem that people are facing which is outside of the Muslim community or outside of a certain demographic, but it affects all of us. Now, to understand what the root causes of radicalization is, we have to look to see what is a common factor among extremists. Because when we can identify that common factor, then we can eradicate it. Then we can put a stop to it. What we see when we look at extremists, as was just shown in the video, is that it's not always Muslims that are extremists. That's one important thing, that's one first point that's important to understand. Even though we may not be aware of it, but there's extremists and terrorists that exist even in the world today that are doing acts of terrorism. For example, in the Central African Republic, there are Christian militants who are exterminating Muslims from one village to the other in the name of Christianity. Now obviously they don't represent Christianity, but we can see that people are abusing the peaceful teachings of Jesus, peace be on him, to justify their radical ideas. Then we also have in Uganda, there's a Lord's Liberation Army. That's a group of people who are fighting to try and forcefully apply the 10 Commandments within their country. And they're waging a bloody war, identifying themselves as Christian militants. This is also something that's present in the world today, using the peaceful teachings of Jesus, peace be on him, to try and somehow justify violence. Then also we have, just a couple of years ago, the Danish shooter who went on a rampage and killed dozens of people, also identifies himself as a Christian extremist, or a Christian militant actually. So what this just shows and just puts into perspective is that even though we may not hear about this on the news, even though this perception might have found its way into our minds, but radicalization is not something that is exclusively an Islamic problem. What we find is that there is a common vein in radicalization, and that is that where a few factors come together, whether religion is there or not, that radicalization will happen. And that is an age. Usually those who are radicalized belong to a certain bracket of age. Then there is impressionability. Then there's ignorance. If people are generally ignorant, then radicalization happens. And then finally, if there is discontentment, then also radicalization happens. Now when we see these factors coming together, whether their religion is there, whether it's not there, radicalization happens. Take for example what's happening in Greece right now. They're going through a financial crisis. There's a lot of discontent, a long-running discontent, long-running unemployment. People are angry over there. And they're facing a sort of national disgrace that's happening in a way, in how they're being threatened to be kicked out of the European Union. Now what's surprising is that in Greece, a far right-wing party that's very racist and very extremist is actually rising and gaining influence. The Golden Dawn is what they call themselves. And they're actually gaining seats of representation in government as well. So here also we see that in the absence of religion, even government and politics is enough to radicalize people and cause extremism to come forward. This is the same pattern, the same disturbing pattern that happened after World War I, when oppressive sanctions were imposed onto Germany. An environment was created of discontentment, of people, of young people being more than impressionable as they ordinarily are. And so then Hitler was able to create a movement that gathered momentum that otherwise he never would have been able to. Now Hitler, he never actually won the majority population of the vote in any election. But what he was able to do was to gather the discontentment of society and make it into enough momentum to be able to take control of the government. And so that is how the Nazi Party came into force. So radicalization and extremism happens when these factors come together. And it's not affected by religion. So even if we were to hypothetically remove Islam from the world, radicalization would still exist. So there are some people who argue, some atheists who argue, once I was discussing with an atheist, who was saying that, radicalization is actually just a religious problem. If we were to eradicate religion from the world, if we were to cleanse the world of religion, if we were to cleanse the world of this disease of religion, then we would have an atheist utopia and there would no longer be any extremism. Now this sounds attractive to many atheists, this idea, but the fact is that logically it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It ends up falling on its own foundation. Because if in reality religion is something that was just invented by people, if it is an opium for the masses that was created by people, then what that means is that there must have been a time when there was no religion, when there was an absence of religion, when there was an absence of belief in God. It means there must have been a time in our history when there were only atheists. And so what we find is that if we accept this sort of hypothetical theory on history, what results is that all the extremism we are seeing today is actually the result of atheism. There had to have been some atheist extremist in the past who decided at some point to invent religion, and then that created all the problems that we're having today. So even if we eradicated religion today, and we created an atheist utopia, what would happen? We would just have another atheist extremist come forward and create religion all over again, and start to create all the destruction once again. So what this shows is that even that logic falls upon itself when it comes and circles back around. You remove Islam, you remove Christianity, you remove religion altogether, extremism, radicalization will still exist. Because unfortunately it's a symptom of a corrupted human tendency towards violence that happens. And that symptom and that human disease is what has to be corrected. Now another point to keep in mind is that what we see today as far as radicalization goes We do see it among Christians, we do see it among people who are atheists or don't identify themselves with any religion either. But like I said, with Hitler even, his radicalization was politically motivated. It wasn't really religiously motivated. Initially he identified himself as a Christian, but later on there are quotes of him denouncing Christianity. So that's kind of an open debate that happens where Christians try and say that no, he wasn't Christian, atheists say that no, he wasn't atheist. Whatever he was, it just shows that you don't have to belong to a religion to be an extremist and to be radicalized. So what it shows is that when we look at the world today, then we see that radicalization is not confined to Islam. But also we can't overlook the fact that Muslims are more radical than comparison to other religions and other peoples. So here the question might arise that why is it that we see Muslims as being more extremist as compared to other people and other sects and other demographics? Now here also there's a need to look at history from a wide lens, to understand extremism as it has manifested itself through history. What we find today in the world presently is that the Muslim world is going through a dark ages. And so that's why extremism exists there. These factors of discontentment and ignorance and impressionability, they all exist in the Muslim world right now. But this wasn't the case 500 years ago and 1,000 years ago. At that time, there was an intellectual renaissance happening in the Muslim world. And in fact, at that time, that was when Europe was in its dark ages. And when we look at Europe during its dark ages, we see the same extremism and radicalization that we see among the Muslims today. For example, in Europe, there were more people burned at the stake in the name of Christianity because they were thought to be guilty of witchcraft than they were burned in the entire history of Islam. The Spanish Inquisitions, the forcible conversion of South America, all of these were extremism, was a symptom of radicalization that happened in Europe. But it didn't happen because of Christianity. It happened because of ignorance and discontentment, which channeled itself through an abuse of Christianity. And so we saw people being burned at the stake and being lit on fire while they were alive because of that ignorance. And so now, 500 years later, when Europe has come out of its dark ages and come into a renaissance, and the Muslim world has left its renaissance and gone into a dark ages, what do we see? We see the full circle coming right back around. And now ISIS is burning people alive and burning people at the stake and doing all sorts of heinous crimes in the name of religion that were done 700 years ago, 500 years ago in the name of another religion in another dark age in another continent. So what we find is that radicalization and extremism are not something that have anything to do with religion. They are an unfortunate consequence of a violent and corrupt human condition, a human nature when it becomes corrupted to turn towards violence. So if we wish to try to solve the problem of ISIS, to stop the crisis of ISIS, the first and most important step is to understand what radicalization is, what extremism is, and how it has to be addressed. When we can diagnose it, then we can begin to address it. Now, what we see on the news and what we see is we're exposed to so much propaganda about ISIS and the counter-propaganda from Islamophobes and all this. It may create an impression among many people about what Muslims actually are. And this affects our public impression. When we hear again and again that Muslims are extremists, that Muslims are blowing things up, they're doing all these crazy things, people start to get apprehensive. There was a poll done recently where it was found that many people are really not comfortable with a Muslim moving in next door to them. People who are not that familiar with Muslims, they have this sort of underlying, even whether it's not conscious but subconscious Islamophobia that somehow starts to develop. And one way to combat this crisis of ISIS is also to humanize one another, to humanize Muslims that we know, and what the average American Muslim is. So now we'll transition into a short video where we try and demonstrate or try and just show that this is what the average American Muslim is. The average American Muslim is a peace-loving, loyal citizen of this country. There's no conflict between loyalty to country and the teachings of Islam. There's no conflict between being a peaceful person and being a Muslim. But all of these things come together in harmony and make a true American who is a Muslim who is American.
I have a question.
Yes.
Can I ask it now or maybe?
I think we're going to have a question answer at the end so we can have it.
My name is Adam Alexander. I accepted Islam 6 years ago. some people, they go on a spiritual journey. There's no doubt about that. People travel the world far and wide to find themselves. We're always looking for themselves, searching for themselves. I have to admit that I was in the same category as well. There was something that I was looking for, but I didn't exactly know what it was. When I had some friends who introduced me to Islam and I had read the Quran and I finished the Quran, it was when I finished it that I realized what it is that I didn't have. I didn't have that spirituality. I didn't have that understanding of a God or a creator. But there was something that I had been seeking my whole life, and I was living without that. And when I read the Quran, I actually found what it is I was looking for. It wasn't me all along that I was searching for. It was my creator I was searching for. The thing that people don't understand about Islam is that the biggest things you have to do in Islam is help each other. There are two things a Muslim has to do. He has to help mankind, and he has to pray to God. But God has put helping mankind ahead of him. So when I was out in Alberta and I had accepted Islam, the first thing that I thought was I had found what I had been looking for. The second thing I thought is, what's my family going to think about this? It was strange for my family. They didn't have a Muslim friend, Muslim co-worker. We didn't have Muslim neighbors. I was the first Muslim my family knew. But this was a good impression for them because they knew what I was like before Islam. And they know now what I'm like after Islam. By adopting those teachings of the Holy Quran, my mom has saw the change. I've read the Quran in English many times. I've never seen anything in the Quran that incites to violence. In fact, I've seen teachings of great compassion, and I think a lot of these misconceptions would go away if people actually picked up the Quran and read it. See, the Quran is very, very descriptive of the Creator, and it emphasizes the importance of recognizing the Creator.
Now, as we went over, one of the first ways to combat radicalization and to combat ISIS is through understanding what the real root of radicalization is. And from that we can begin to undo this problem or attack the problem at its root. And one of the ways in which we can do that is to refute the ideology that ISIS puts forward. But the reason that ISIS is able to gain the level of success that it does is because they have been able to convince people that they are somehow promoting the true teachings of Islam, that somehow they are representatives of what Islam actually teaches. However, when we look at the actual doctrines of Islam, we find that Islam does not actually have any room for any of the things that ISIS teaches, any of the things that they propagate. In fact, it is because of their agenda being pushed by their own selves and also by those people who are most afraid of them. That is actually one of the reasons why they are able to get this much of a following, this much of attention, and create this much of a stir in society. Now, the way that ISIS justifies its actions is the same way that extremists have always justified their actions, which is to take certain verses from the scriptures from Islam, from the Holy Quran, and quote them out of context in a way where it makes it seem as if they are violent, where it makes it seem as if they somehow promote attacks and conquests. But this kind of referencing is something that can be done to prove just about anything. For example, if a person wanted to simply cherry pick different quotations out of the Holy Quran, they can actually prove that prayer is forbidden in the Holy Quran. A person can prove literally that the Holy Quran says that you should not pray. Allah Almighty says in the Holy Quran that La taqrabus salat, that do not go near prayer. But after that He also says that wa antum sukara, while you are in a state of being inebriated or outside of your senses. God Almighty also says that فَوَيْلٌ لِلْمُصَلِّينَ, that cursed be those who pray. But after that He also says الَّذِينَ هُمْ عَنْ صَلَاتِهِمْ سَاهُونَ, that those who are unmindful of their prayer and do it as a mere formality. So this is exactly the same way that ISIS uses to try and promote their idea of extremism, of warfare and violence through the teachings of Islam. But when we look at the teachings of Islam from a more broad perspective, we find that there is no room for any of that in the teachings of Islam. I just want to give you a few general quotations from the Holy Quran that will just give you a broad idea of what it is that the Holy Quran actually teaches about jihad. And then you can understand yourself whether there's any room for the actions of ISIS to be found within the Holy Quran. And understanding this, knowing this knowledge and having this understanding is a very important step in stopping the crisis. Because ignorance can only flourish so long as the darkness of ignorance remains. But as soon as knowledge comes, it shines and then that ignorance disappears. So if a person knows this Quran, then as it begins to spread, the ignorant ideology simply cannot flourish in that environment. Now in chapter 22, verse 40, God Almighty states that it is permission to fight is granted because in doing so, they were standing up for the freedom of religion for all people. Then also elsewhere in the Holy Quran, it says in chapter 2, verse 191, that Allah Almighty says that never transgress or act cruelly, because Allah loves not those who transgress. Then in chapter 16, verse 127, God Almighty commands Muslims to never exceed the limits even during warfare. Then in chapter 2, verse 194, God Almighty says that during a war, if the oppressor desists, then no further hostility should be shown against him. Then after this, in chapter 8, verse 62, it says that if the oppressor is inclined towards peace and reconciliation, then the Muslims must accept it without hesitation. Then in chapter 5, verse 9, Allah instructs Muslims to always act fairly even in a state of war, and that nothing should lead the Muslims to act unjustly because that is against righteousness. And then finally, the quote in chapter 2, which was recited at the beginning of this meeting, which is that there is no compulsion in religion, that no one has any right to compel anyone in matters of religion. Now in light of all of these quotations, we can see that the only way that a person can actually justify violence and aggressive warfare in Islam is if they ignore all of these teachings and try and choose some other teachings out of context that makes it seem as if Islam teaches this. Now what's unfortunate is that if ISIS was alone promoting these teachings, it actually wouldn't spread that much, it wouldn't get that far. But they're actually using the national media in the United States as a mouthpiece for their message, and they're succeeding to a great extent. And the reason why they're succeeding is very ironic. And it is because extremists who are pushing for a very violent interpretation of Islam are on one end. And on the other polar opposite, there is the extremists who hate Islam, who are Islamophobes. But what's unusual is that they both have the exact same agenda. They are both pushing the exact same interpretation of Islam. And so that is where these two extremes actually find common cause. And that is how the message of ISIS gets pushed forward. But there's a story that is found in Islamic Sufi literature which demonstrates this in a way. There was one Sufi who says that he was walking along and then he saw something unusual that he had never seen before. He saw a crow and a pigeon sitting together. It was something that struck him as being out of the ordinary, and he couldn't understand why they were sitting together because they have nothing in common. And so he decided to sit close by and just continue to watch them to figure out what it was that made them attracted to each other. Finally, when the birds decided to fly off, he noticed something unique about them. And that was that both of them were missing a leg. Both of them, at some point in their life, had suffered an injury and had lost a leg, and they were both kind of crippled birds in a way. And that was how he realized that like attracts like. Even two birds that have nothing else in common, if they have one thing in common, they find something to find company with, to be with one another about. And so this same analogy is what we find in those who are Islamic extremists who hate American culture or Western culture, and then on the other end those who are Islamophobes, who hate Islam and hate Muslim culture and everything about it. Both of them are pushing the same extremist Islamic ideology. On one end we have ISIS pushing a very violent interpretation of Islam. And on the other hand we have people who hate Islam, Islamophobic people who are saying that look, Islam is a violent religion, and they're also basing all of their knowledge on the same interpretations and verses and twisted interpretations of verses that ISIS is basing it on. And so we have both of these extremes actually coming together to a common view. And then everyone in between, the moderate Muslims, and not just the moderate Muslims, even the moderate everybody's, they're pushing and trying to push the view with not as much success because it's not as exciting of a message, but the idea and the view that religion is not what causes radicalization. Islam is not what causes violence and causes people to become violent. So one of the ways, and very important ways, to stop the crisis is true knowledge and understanding. Extremism is something that can only flourish where there is discontentment and ignorance. And where ignorance is dispelled, then extremism on its own is dispelled. Where people come to a point where they understand and know that Islam does not actually teach violence, that the Holy Quran does not sanction this, that if a person reads the book from beginning to end, there is no room for such violence in the Holy Quran, then it itself is the best way to stop the crisis that is ISIS. So now we'll again transition into another video that will give us some insight before moving on to the next part of the session.
All men of God seek their Creator in the stillness of solitude. For many years before he received the divine call, in the surrounding mountains of Mecca, the Prophet would seek God on solitary retreats to a cave called Hira, where he would stay for days at a time. On one fateful day in the year 610, in the peace of solitude, he received his first revelation from God. That encounter was the beginning of the Quran.
اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق خلق الإنسان من علق اقرأ وربك الأكرم الذي علم بالقلم علم الإنسان ما لم يعلم.
In the 1400 years since its revelation, the Quran is universally accepted as being unaltered. Not a dot of it has changed, a miraculous distinction that religious scholars of all stripes testify to. Verily, we ourselves have sent down this exhortation, and most surely we will be its guardian. For 14 centuries, its recitation has mesmerized people the world over. Therein, verily, are signs for a people who reflect. It is the most recited book in the history of mankind, as over 1 billion Muslims recite its verses every single day in all 5 prayers. It is a book that fosters spirituality, only in the remembrance of God do hearts find comfort. It is a message of mercy. Surely God is the most forgiving and merciful. A message of forbearance. A message of equality. Allah rewards the believing men and women. It grants freedom of religion to all and is categorical about freedom of conscience. There is no compulsion in religion. It is universal in its concept of the divine. All praise belongs to Allah, Lord of all the worlds. The Quran brings humanity together by teaching that all religions at their root are true. In fact, Muslims must believe in the truth of all prophets and emphasizes that they are all from the same one true God. Even more, the Quran grants the prophets of all religions a position of great honor, bringing people from all creeds together. And its message grants hope to all, that the gates to God's mercy are not just for one nation or one people, but for all who make good with their Lord. Ultimately, a book of this nature and composition, of this emotion and depth, of this spirituality, is not a manual of ideology. It is a scripture of spirituality. It is not a manifesto for militants. It is a guide for the seeker, for those in search of God, becoming at one with their Creator, and with the creation who wish to fulfill the rights of God and man, who seek peace in their hearts and peace on earth.
Now, another idea that ISIS put forward is the idea of Sharia, that it is necessary to establish the Sharia of Islam, and also that it is necessary for all true Muslims to migrate to the land that they are occupying where the Sharia has been established, and only there can a person be a proper Muslim and a true Muslim. And they also claim that they have established the true law of Islam, and the way in which they have established, they claim, is the way that Islam has taught that it should be established, in a way that it is imposed on all people under their subjugation. And also, they are of the belief that their state has to spread and conquer, that this Islamic state must gain more and more lands and more peoples to conquer the entirety of the world. This is the idea that they put forward. And they don't just put it forward on their own, but they try and justify it from the teachings of Islam. Now here also, in order to be able to stop the crisis of ISIS, the only way to do it, and the most effective way to do it, is not with the jihad of guns and bombs and that sort of thing. Although that is also a necessary measure. That is something that has to be done. Now, all the Muslim countries that are around ISIS, and also we as Ahmadi Muslims agree that military action has to be taken against the people who are this oppressive and this deviated from the right, from any type of humanity. However, the more important war or the more important jihad that has to be done is jihad of the pen, and refutation of their ideologies. And so here also we see that in this idea of Sharia that they put forward, this also is not based on the teachings of the Holy Quran. The way in which they have established it is also not based on the Holy Quran. Firstly, there is the idea of dictatorship. Dictatorship is something that is not permitted in Islam. In the Holy Quran, Allah Almighty says that وَأَمْرُهُمْ شُورَى بَيْنَهُمْ, that the believers are those whose affairs are decided by mutual consultation among themselves. So any type of dictatorship wherein a person has absolute authority, he does not consult his subjects in any way, and exercises that type of government where there is no type of democracy that is found, that is something that goes against the principles of the Holy Quran. Then also, what God Almighty says and teaches Muslims in the Holy Quran is that all of their authority should be given to those who are worthy of it. That Allah Almighty says that Allah commands you to make over the trust to those who are entitled to them. This is also the precept of democracy which is found in the Holy Quran, that monarchy and dictatorship is not something that is permitted. A person does not have a right to leadership just because he was born into a certain family, just because he claims that right. But it is something that, a right that the people have. This is what Allah Almighty says, that Allah ordains you that that you have a trust and you should give that trust of rule over to the person who is most deserving of it. So rule is actually something that belongs to the people, which they give to the ruler. It is a right that the people have and they give it to a trust as a responsibility to the ruler. So this is also a basic principle of the Holy Quran. And so any type of monarchy or dictatorship from that perspective is also something that is not permitted. This is something that we see in the example of the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be on him, and his rightly guided caliphs after him. He himself became to be the head of state of the city of Medina by the mutual agreement of not only the Muslims but also the pagans and the Jewish tribes of that area as well. Then also the Khulafa that came after him came to become Khulafa by the mutual consultation and agreement of the Muslims of that time, of the constituency that were representatives in Medina at that time. So what this shows is that this idea of a caliph that is a dictator or a monarch or just forcefully takes authority, this is something that is not justified from the Holy Quran in any way. Then also, there is the idea of jihad and of expanding territories. This is something also that those who are in ISIS claim is a fundamental part of their ideology. The idea of establishing the Sharia and of spreading it. Now their idea of Sharia is also something that is not consistent with what the Prophet Muhammad, peace be on him, brought. Because what we see in his life is that the government that he established is actually very similar to the government of the United States that we see here in this country. In fact, it can almost be said that the government of the United States is modeled after the government that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be on him, established. Here in the United States, we have a federal government and a state government. And this is also what the Prophet Muhammad, peace be on him, established. When he came to the city of Medina, he was elected as the ruler of the entire country of Medina, the country that came under his rulership. And within that country, there were various states. There was the Muslim state, and there were 3 different Jewish tribes that constituted their own individual states. He was the head of the federal government, and there were federal laws that he imposed upon all of his people that had to do with basic inalienable human rights, common things that everyone believed in as far as law and order. And then each of the individual states within his country had the right to draft laws according to their own beliefs, in order to their own ideals. And so the Muslim state within his country established Islamic Sharia. The Jewish state within his country established Judaic Sharia. If there had been other people living within the different states, then those states would have enacted Jewish law or any other law as well. And so the government that he established at that time was similar to what we see today, where we have the head of a federal government. And then within each state there are laws that vary, and they can vary a great deal. For example, in California there's capital punishment, in many other states there isn't. In certain states, they even went so far as to make adultery a felony. In many other states on the books, it's considered a misdemeanor. In other states, it's not considered a crime at all. So between states here in the United States, there are laws that vary a great deal. And each state has its own freedom to make individual local laws. This is the Sharia, in fact, that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be on him, brought. And this is the democracy that we see that has been established in the United States already as it is. And so the Sharia that ISIS teaches, or the one that it imposes upon its people, in this way does not follow the example of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be on him, as we find it recorded in his life. Then finally, there's the example of jihad, where they say that this Sharia must be spread to all other borders. It must be imposed upon other people. Now here also, the reason and the only way in which they can justify this is because of the ignorance of people on what the teachings of Islam actually teach, by taking verses that are very specific and using them to justify violence. Now, one example of this I'll give to you is a verse of the Holy Quran that you may have heard before. It's a quotation of the Holy Quran that extremist Muslims quote, and also those on the far other end, the Islamophobic people also quote, to prove that Islam is a violent religion. And that is the beginning of verse 192 of Surah Baqarah, where Allah Almighty says, "And kill them wherever you meet them, and drive them out from where they have driven you out." Now, according to this verse, violence and jihad, conquest, is something that is justified by the teachings of Islam. But what the reality is that this type of interpretation can only be justified if a person forces a verse of the Holy Quran out of its context and then forces it to contradict other verses of the Holy Quran. Now, there's a lecture on TED.com where a Jewish lady, she went through the entirety of the Holy Quran. Now, this is just something kind of like an experiment or an exercise she did, where she read the entirety of the Holy Quran with various translations simultaneously until she went through the whole thing just to see how the experience would be, what she would learn. And she said that what she found was that so many of the things that we hear about Islam in the media and about violence and about paradise, the misconceptions about paradise and all these things, they're simply fabrications, or they're simply things taken out of context. All of the verses that have to do with jihad, they are given with different types of limitations, different types of guards on how a person is not able to abuse any of those rights. So this also is a perfect example of a verse on how the teachings of Islam are misrepresented by extremists, and how by understanding and having knowledge we can actually refute those types of extremism. Now let's look at this verse in the actual context in which it is found. We see that God Almighty teaches Muslims in the Holy Quran that fight in the cause of Allah against those who fight against you. So this is the first principle of the Holy Quran. In fact, this is how jihad is actually permitted. There's a fundamental verse in the Holy Quran where God Almighty says that fighting is now permitted on this condition, that because you were wrong, because you were attacked. And the justification is that if you did not defend yourselves, then churches and mosques and synagogues and cloisters, they would be torn down. There would be more violence if you did not defend yourselves and go on a defensive warfare. So this is the first principle of fighting as it is sanctioned in Islam. Then after this, Muslims are taught, but do not transgress. They even in war hold on to justice. Surely Allah loves not the transgressors. Then comes the part of the verse that is quoted, and kill them wherever you meet them and drive them out from where they have driven you out. Then after this, God Almighty says to Muslims, for persecution is worse than killing. It shows that this verse is in the context of religious persecution, not necessarily in the context of a political war, but a religious war of oppression that is waged against people. Then after this it is said, and fight them not in or near the sacred mosque until they fight you therein, but if they fight you, then fight them. Such is the requital of the disbelievers. Again, defense is emphasized. But if they desist, then surely Allah is most forgiving, merciful. Now here again, this is a principle that's repeatedly established in the Holy Quran, that if you are fighting with the people and they desist from fighting, then you no longer have the right to continue fighting. Then you must accept the terms of peace that they offer. This is the extent to which Islam goes to prevent warfare and to even stop it while it is happening. And then finally, Muslims are taught, and fight them until there is no persecution and religion is freely professed for Allah. But if they desist, then remember that no hostility is allowed except against the transgressors. Here also, God Almighty teaches Muslims that you should continue to fight them until there is no longer religious persecution. And the followers of any religion can profess their religion for no other reason than for the sake of God, not under any compulsion or any fear of any other people. So this is a verse, and this is just an example of how extremists take things out of context to justify their interpretations. And the only way that they can do it is if they know that we are all sitting here ignorant about what is actually in the Holy Quran. But when a person enlightens themselves on what the actual teachings of Islam are, that is the most effective way to stop the crisis, to stop ISIS in its tracks. Now, one question may remain on this verse. Then what about that section of the verse which is condoning violence? Even with all these restrictions, these words sound a little bit harsh, don't they? Then kill them wherever you meet them and drive them out from where they have driven you out. Here also, the religion of Islam in fact teaches peace. Because this is a universal principle of warfare, which is that war should be prevented for the sake of peace as long as it possibly can be. Every measure should be taken to be steadfast, to be patient. But when a person is attacked by an oppressor, whether it's a religious or a political war, then a person is forced to fight for the sake of peace. And if a person is pacifist at that moment, then those who are oppressors will be the ones who are victorious. Well, if we were pacifists, we were all pacifists, and the entire world would be Nazi right now. But we fought them back, and that's the reason why we have a peaceful world in relation to what it could have been. So war is sometimes necessary. And when war becomes necessary, then attacking with full force is actually the means of peace. That is the means of saving lives and establishing peace. And this is also a universal principle we see in the history of warfare. That when an attack is done decisively in a war, then lives are saved, lives are spared. The greatest casualties that happened in battles was when battles were allowed to stall into stalemates. In Stalingrad, in the Eastern Front on World War II, in the trenches of World War I, that is where tens of millions of people died. But it was when a person makes an effective attack, when he makes warfare in a forceful way, that is how a war is decided decisively and ended decisively. So this is how the Prophet Muhammad, peace be on him, practiced warfare. That he was patient so long as he possibly could be. And then when there was no choice, then he fought with such force that it eliminated the need for war. That he did not allow war to fall into a stalemate. And what the result of this is, that we may have heard much about how the Prophet Muhammad, peace be on him, was, God forbid, a warlord or a warrior prophet or someone who promoted jihad. But the reality that we find, so when we look at the statistics, you may be surprised to find that in the entirety of his life, there were only about 1,000 people who died on both sides of the battle. Throughout all the battles of his lifetime, throughout all the wars that he went through, on both sides only about 1,000 people died during his lifetime. This was because of peace that he promoted. And when he was forced to fight, he fought in a way that was most conducive and effective to the saving of lives and to promoting peace. So, from these little snippets of just understanding these simple subjects on which ISIS has taken a stand, we can realize that stopping ISIS and stopping the crisis of ISIS is something that we as individuals can do. This is not just something that we as Ahmadiyya Muslims or any other sect of Muslims or whatever it is, even a non-Muslim can fight against the crisis of ISIS with knowledge and with understanding, with knowing what the teachings of Islam are, by refuting the ideologies that ISIS is putting forward. That is how we can end the crisis. And this is something that the Ahmadiyya Muslim community is doing, and this is something that we can all do. But from the beginning of our community, we've been promoting peace. We've been promoting the idea that jihad is only something that is justified in self-defense. And so long as there is no religious persecution and no people are waging war against the Muslims for religious reasons, there is no reason to justify any kind of jihad. And so this is the type of jihad of the pen and jihad of the intellect that we must all engage in if we wish to make an effective war, an ideological and intellectual war against the crisis of ISIS. So now we'll transition into our last video before we go into the question and answer session about some of the efforts that our community is making to stop this crisis. And this is just the humble efforts that we are making. But this is something that all of us can do in order to be a part of stopping radicalization and extremism within our society.
The Ahmadiyya Muslim community was established by Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad in Qadian, a small and remote village in India. He claimed to be the expected reformer of the latter days, the one awaited by all the major world religions. Founded in 1889, the community has continued to spread throughout the world, flourishing under Caliphate, the system of spiritual leadership established after the demise of the holy founder. The current successor of the movement, Hazrat Mirza Masroor Ahmad, continues the work of the holy founder to revive the spiritual and moral state of mankind. The movement embodies the benevolent message of Islam in its pristine purity. A movement that preaches peace, universal brotherhood, and the submission to the will of God. Ahmadi Muslims have earned the distinction and reputation of being a law-abiding and peaceful community. Within a century, the community has reached all the corners of the earth and has been recognized and praised by the global community.
In the past 100 years, you have given so much to the society in the United Kingdom and to societies everywhere globally. You are among those who give.
And wherever Ahmadis live in the world, you are renowned for enthusiastically participating in the larger community and peacefully living alongside people of all faiths, languages, and cultures. All Calgarians, Albertans, and Canadians can see in this mosque the true and benevolent face of Islam and those who worship in its name. They will also see your love for Canada and your patriotism. Ahmadis have embraced Canada, and Canada has embraced you.
Let us make this resolution to promote the message of peace and brotherhood, which is your message to mankind. That people of different religions should not quarrel and fight with each other, but should accept and tolerate and live together in that spirit of brotherhood and peace, which is the essence of your religion.
Under the leadership of its spiritual successors, Ahmadiyya Muslim community has now built over 15,000 mosques, over 500 schools, and over 30 hospitals. It has translated the Holy Quran into over 70 languages. It propagates the true teachings of Islam and the message of peace and tolerance through our 24-hour satellite television channel, MTA, and the internet. As one of the fundamental principles of Islam is to serve the creation of God, one's fellow human beings, it has been at the forefront of worldwide disaster relief through an independent charitable organization, Humanity First.
If you believe in Creator, you must also believe in His creation. If you love the artist, you must also love his art. As such, our concept of Islam is so beautiful and so well poised that it has started attracting attention all over the world.
So now we can go into the last part of our session, which is that if anyone has any questions, then we can address them now.
How is it do you think that ISIS has been successful at recruiting young people from all over the world. And then I'm curious if anybody in here has had any experience like that, or knows anybody who has had that experience.
Well, ISIS is something that, as I mentioned in the beginning, that because of the sort of common ground that they have found with Islamophobes, that those who are Islamophobic and those who are Islamic extremists, they are both pushing the same interpretation of Islam. And so this is one of the reasons why they have received so much attention. And a lot of their things are done as publicity stunts as well. And so we kind of get a picture of ISIS being much larger than it actually is. The estimates of how much, what their army is perhaps 20,000, 30,000. That's the last numbers I heard. It's a very insignificant number. So it's actually more of a type of fear factor, where something heinous happens and we start thinking that perhaps all of society is falling apart, whereas it's actually not something that's that significant. Now, the last numbers I saw, which was that about 2,000 people, perhaps in Western countries, have become radicalized and have gone to Syria. And I think about maybe 50 or 60 of them were from here in North America, or perhaps from here in the United States. So that's still a pretty significant number. That's still a very scary number. But still, it's not something that's that major. It's not something that's that much of a crisis. But the reason why we hear about it so much is because of the amount of news coverage that they get. Now, why is it happening? That's one of the things that we covered, which is just a sort of discontentment that exists among people, where age is a factor, where people are young, where they're impressionable, where they're looking for some kind of purpose, and where they have that energy that is not being channeled properly. And so this is something that manifests itself as kind of extremism. It manifests itself even in political purposes as well. In the absence of religion, when there are people who are being politically oppressed, they also start to gravitate towards this type of extremism and start to indulge in this type of radicalization. So I think these are common factors that we see universally across the board when it comes to radicalization, whether it's in religious movements or whether it's in political movements. And I don't know if anyone here, I hope, well, we'll see, you can see if somebody can share, they have an experience of someone they know who's gotten radicalized. I hope that's not the case.
Well, if you said there's 50 from North America, I mean, that's a really, really small number.
Yeah. That's the last number I read. I think it was 50 or 60, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, the media picks up on it, so it probably seems more extreme than it is.
But they're saying right now, about a few months or about a year, they might get up to 9,000 people. They're going to, from different parts of the world, where they're going to fight. About 9,000. That's a significant amount of people going to come and fight.
Yeah. I mean, these are projections, and I suppose we'll just have to see when we get there. But the thing is that ISIS is something that, its ideology is something that it either has to be very successful or it'll bleed itself out. Because, as I said, that the reason it's attracting people is because it's selling itself as an Islamic state that is sort of, in a way, not really divinely ordained, but it has some sort of divine backing that this is the true Islam and it's going to spread and they're fulfilling prophecies and that sort of thing. And so their success is based on this promise that they're making to their followers, that this success of the Islamic state and its spread is something that is a sign of its truth. And so now what we see is that because they've made so many enemies, not just the United States and that sort of thing, even their neighboring Muslim countries, even their neighboring local regions within Iraq and Syria are against them. Like the Kurds of Iraq and also the Shias and other Sunni groups as well. That not only are they coming under warfare on the ground, but from airstrikes from other countries, they're actually losing ground in certain areas as well. One of their I was reading recently on BBC that one of the ISIS was admitting that they had lost their hold on certain parts of the territory that they had previously gained. So it's possible that they may, I'm not sure what those projections of them getting up to 90,000 people are based on, but they either have to get those 90,000 or people are going to start losing faith in them. And so that's likely what's going to end up happening, as I see it, which is that they're probably just going to be bitten off more than they can chew. They're going to bleed out eventually, and then it's just going to die its own death. And this is something that the Khalifa of Islam, the head of our Ahmadiyya Muslim community, has said as well. He said that ISIS is going to die its own death. But just because it disappears, which it inevitably will, doesn't mean that this problem of radicalization will disappear. And so this is a universal thing that we have to be aware of, and we have to address, that wherever discontentment exists, whether it was Nazi Germany, whether it is Greece today, or perhaps whether it is the United States in the future, that this discontentment has to be something that is addressed to prevent extremism from cropping up.
The term you just used right now, Khalifa of Islam, what does that mean? Like, what is the Khalifa of all Islam or only sect of Ahmadiyya?
The sect of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. Yes.
So I remember you were talking about media and everything, presenting ISIS and making it like a big deal out of it. How does that stop? Stop that premise? Because I feel like it's, CNN and all those media outlets, shows and stuff. They only do their own thing. They don't
Well, it is difficult, and like when you have ISIS that does something that is as sensational as it does, then it's difficult to ignore it. It's like a child, throwing a tantrum to get attention. You can't really do much. It's very difficult to ignore that child. So this, on a certain level, what ISIS is doing, and what's unfortunate is that we, on a human level, whether we admit it or not, we are a little bit morbid in that we do get interested in hearing about acts of violence, of atrocities and things like that, and these news stations know that. That's what gets the clicks, that's what gets the viewership. So as long as that remains, there's not a whole lot we can do about it, because people are interested in it. But one thing that we can do is call attention to that fact. And one of the ways to do it is just by being active in our own circle in whatever area we are able to do. So one example is the recent Chapel Hill shooting that happened. Now this is something where a person shot 3 Muslims. He was an anti-theist, he had like anti-religious beliefs. We don't know if it was a hate crime or not. But what we do know is that if the roles were reversed, if it was a Muslim who had shot 3 white people, then it would have definitely made the news. Because whenever Muslims make the news for violence, it is kind of assumed right off the bat that it must be a terrorist attack, it must be some Islamically motivated radicalization or extremism. But then on the other hand, what we find is that when it is not a Muslim, but perhaps it is a white person who killed 3 Muslims, then the narrative goes more towards, well, perhaps he was mentally unstable, perhaps he was, perhaps it was a parking dispute or something like that. You're not going to hear on the news that a Muslim kills 3 people execution style and we think it was probably a parking dispute. No, the first narrative that comes up is the fact that it was extremist. And this bias also exists in other ways as well. For example, against the African American community. That, gang violence or robbery is something that is assumed many times before, and it's not really thought that, okay, maybe he was just mentally unstable, maybe he was just discontent or an anarchist or something like that. Now, what this Chapel Hill shooting brought was something interesting, which is that this glaring contradiction in the reporting in the American media was something that was felt so strongly among the masses that a grassroots Twitter movement started, which actually trended to the extent that then national news media actually ended up having to report on this news. It ended up on BBC and CNN and all the major news outlets, and even Obama gave a statement on it. So this shows that how on an individual level a person can point out and call out news stations for having this type of bias. Because news stations can only be biased to a certain extent while pretending to be, neutral about it. So that's one thing that we can do. Another thing which is quite effective, that we found effective in our community, is writing to news outlets. Writing op-eds, writing letters to the editors. It's surprising that an ordinary person, your college students, whatever it is, you can get published if it's a well-written piece, if you practice it. The first one may not get accepted, but the next one after that may end up getting accepted. And once you get published, you get more into it. Our sort of Muslim Writers Guild that we have here in the United States, it's all just young guys, college students, college grads, not scholars on Islam or anything like that, but they know their basics. And just in the month of January, they were able to get 100 publications across the United States. So this is also one way that ordinary people, we can affect the narrative in the media just by taking up the pen, and whether we're Muslims or not, but by fighting that sort of ideological and intellectual warfare against ignorance.
I think that's a good point, because when the Chapel Hill shooting happened, the media didn't, it was kind of on the down low, they didn't report on it as much. Like you were saying, I saw on Twitter, then everything started kind of rolling. People realize that there is a problem with the portrayal of Islam, because the Islamophobes and everything, realize that it's an actual growing problem.
Yes, and I think one of the most retweeted tweets within that trend was one by Chris Rock, who's not even a Muslim. He's not really personally involved in it. But the fact is that this just shows that even not being a Muslim, what it shows is that when you see some kind of injustice happening, then something should be said about it. And this is how we can all sort of oppose it. It kind of goes according to that saying of Martin Luther King, where he said that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So even if it doesn't concern non-Muslims, it's still a cause that should be taken up. Even for me as a Muslim, if I see some oppression happening, which doesn't affect me directly, which has to do with perhaps Jewish people or African American people or any other minority, then it's each person's ethical responsibility to do what they can to sort of speak out and try and make a difference. And now in this age of social media, and also each person being able to get published in the local newspapers and even in national newspapers, each person can make a change. Each person has access to all of these different forms of media.
So do you think after bombing them or going after them, is it going to stop them?
Well, what the head of our movement, the Khalifa Abdul Masih, has guided is the basic same guidance as found in the Holy Quran. What Allah Almighty teaches Muslims is that if there are two parties among your people who begin to fight, then the countries that are around it, the Muslim countries, they should bring about reconciliation between them. So this is what the head of our community has advised these people, which is that you don't need to have America intervene. You don't have to have people intervening from all over the place. This is a local problem, and it's not that big of a deal. It's 30,000 fighters who have more crude weapons. They don't have an air force or anything like that. So the local Muslim countries that surround it, this is a problem that they can handle if they choose to, if they can unite in that struggle and in that desire for peace. So this is the ideal solution. Otherwise, if they cannot handle it, then obviously, the United States may have to get involved, and this is something that we as, Muslims living in America, this would be our civic duty as well. That if the United States asked us to go and fight against ISIS, then as a Muslim, particularly as Ahmadi Muslims, I can say at least, we would have no qualms about doing that, because it's not a religious war, it's a human war which would be taking place. So opposition to ISIS is something that is not only ideological, but since they are using violence, then that sort of warfare has to be done. Because if a person is pacifist in that situation, it only provokes even further violence.
Yes. How do they, do you have any ideas on how to stop funding ISIS? Because they, I hear they get a lot of money from different people, many white people in this country, all around the world, people from Qatar, and maybe a couple of people in the UAE and stuff like that. What's your ideas about that?
Yeah, actually, this is something I'm not sure of, because it's difficult to tell. I'm not even sure if we have determined yet exactly where all of their money is coming from. As last I checked or last I heard, I'm not up to date on the news on this aspect, but it was still a matter of some mystery of how they're able to fund their operation, whether they're being backed by some major power or something like that. So I'm not sure what the solution to that problem is. I mean, what our country has used in the past is sanctions and different types of economic warfare against countries that do things like this. But I think that isn't as effective on ISIS if there is a sort of subversive support that is happening for them because of some other types of overarching rivalries that are existing in the world. One thing that we see in the world is that Russia is a country that kind of looks for an opportunity to sort of oppose the West. So maybe they have something to do with it, but it's financially, maybe they don't. It's hard to say, but this is something that goes into global politics where people are hesitant to challenge and to perhaps start a potential World War III over a local problem. So I think this is a problem that's been happening even throughout the Cold War, where the USSR and the United States, they fought wars against each other, but through very small countries, whether it was Vietnam or whether it was in Afghanistan or whether it was through the Cuban Missile Crisis or something like that. So I hope that's not actually what's happening here. But I hope that ISIS is not getting its funding from people who are trying to subversively undermine the Western influence in that area. But I'm not sure what the solution to that economic support problem would be.
Yes. What do you think about the fact that the artificial borders in that part of the world are contributing to this situation?
Well, what we see that is that democracy is something that not all people are at a level of maturity to be able to handle. And this is something that unfortunately our foreign policy has not been able to appreciate yet, which is that democracy is something that is a stage of maturity that a society has to reach to be able to actually implement properly. If a society isn't mature enough, then if you impose that sort of democracy on them, then it actually ends up backfiring on them. And what we see in Iraq is that this is a society that wasn't really ready for democracy. In fact, there are some countries that are actually better off right now with a dictatorship, not because dictatorship is right, but because they need time to develop, to get to a point where their society is actually established on justice and corruption is eradicated. You can take the example of the country of Pakistan as an example. Pakistan, a lot of its greatest progress happened when they were under dictatorship. Because whenever they come under a democracy, they start to go right back towards corruption. Now this also applies, we see that, for example, Libya. This was a huge, war, not a war effort, but whatever, a battle that the United States led in the name of eradicating oppression. But we have to take down Gaddafi because he's oppressive. But what was left behind? Libya is completely in ruins right now. It's actually more extremism is, fermenting there, and there's no real leader. It's just jihadist groups. It's just completely gone, completely been destroyed, the country. No organization there. The similar thing has happened in Egypt as well, although not as bad. And then also that's what we see in Iraq. That there Saddam Hussein wasn't oppressive. But an oppressive dictator like that was the only people who keep the Kurds and the Shias and the Sunnis living in peace. But as soon as that dictator was removed and a democracy we tried to establish a democracy without understanding the political situation in that area, then everything just collapsed on its own. So democracy can only be established after a society reaches a level of maturity where it's able to work together without corruption and violence, and also only after understanding how that society works. So, as taking Iraq for example, perhaps the borders of Iraq are not appropriate for it. Maybe the Kurds and the Shias and the Sunnis, they just have such a history of violence and resentment among themselves that perhaps for them to function as a democracy as one country is simply not possible. So perhaps in that situation it would be best for them to be divided into 3 different areas or 3 different independent countries. So that's always a possibility that can be taken into consideration. But I think not having taken these factors into consideration may have given ISIS the opportunity, if needed, to take all of this chaos and discontentment that existed in Iraq and to gather support among the Sunni population to raise their government. So yes, I do think that the borders, and not appreciating the borders, the real borders that existed within Iraq, that probably is something that caused this conflict to a great extent. Where we just looked at Iraq and thought it was Iraq and didn't realize that it's actually very different regions and very diverse regions that need the diversity of policy as well.
You mentioned quite a few things actually, but I'm just trying to say, to my understanding, I know a little history, but just in the saying that what you just mentioned right now, you're basically saying that West caused it because we're the one who killed Saddam Hussein, we were the one who killed Gaddafi, we're the one who started doing everything in Libya. So people from that local area, they're the one that they're right what they're doing right now because they were oppressed by us.
Well, we're not the ones who caused it. Actually, the fact is that
we don't actually take out.
Well, basically, the disease already existed there, and so we thought that we would try and help. Because these people don't just go crazy overnight. There were already these resentments that existed among them, and so when a person removes somebody from power and creates a vacuum, then in the chaos that results, if a proper government is not set up after that, then the chaos that is left there, that chaos is what causes the violence that comes afterwards. So we didn't really cause the violence in that we caused people to fight each other. But by creating a vacuum wherein extremism and radicalization could flourish, that was actually the mistake. It was not an intentional mistake, but it was an unfortunate result of a lack of foresight or whatever we want to call it. And so we tried to help, but actually ended up hurting.
So blame goes to us basically, right?
Well, if we were to be responsible, then we should take responsibility.
Right. That's what I'm saying, because
what ends up is a blame game.
That's what they're using that against us.
Yeah, they do use that against us. Yeah.
And also back in the 18th century and all that, what the brother right now mentioned about borders, we caused it, we built those borders. The French did that for part of it, we did part of it as well. So it was always been there, and then we oppressed them.
Yes, as was mentioned, that the reason for radicalization is ultimately discontentment and ignorance. And when that discontentment is there, when people feel that they've been oppressed by the West or whatever it is, then that's something that creates that. And I think that's why it was important that Obama said in his address yesterday that we have to sort of remove this misconception and actually go and try and help these people as much as we can. Because if we are able to remove this misconception that America is your enemy, we're trying to oppress you, then it'll actually take away from that fuel with which extremists light their fire. Now, it may be true, and it definitely is true, that American foreign policy has been oppressive. It's been very oppressive, unfortunately. That's just a reality of history that we can't deny. But at this point, the best that we can do is to try and sincerely try and repair and undo the damage that has been done. And at this point, that would be a very effective way of combating the crisis of ISIS, which is that if we, as Obama had said yesterday, can convince the people at large that America, yes, we accept that we made mistakes in the past, but we're trying to help, we're not your enemy, and we're not trying to destroy you, but we want to try and build you up, then it would actually, it would actually help the cause a lot. I think one of the reasons why we don't see extremists here in the United States is because when someone comes here to the United States, they see that freedom is good, America is good, they want to be American. Maybe in the wrong sense sometimes too, in the wrong sense of some of the immorality that's found in the promiscuity that goes against what Islam at least teaches, but they like the freedom and the prosperity. And that's why people are more inclined to become suicide bombers when they're hopeless over there. But over here, they're not as inclined to do that. So if people over there are given that hope of having a chance at prosperity, of having a chance at sort of freedom, then this extremism dissipates on its own. So this is one way that's a very effective way to stop the crisis as well. So we'll take one more question, and then we'll end there. But before, is there anyone else other than someone who's already asked a question who'd like to ask a question?
Yeah.
All right, yeah, then we can, maybe we'll do that afterwards. Yes.
Yeah, I was wondering, do you think we can have freedom of speech before democracy? Or does it come together?
What extent? Because freedom of speech is a very complex issue, as has come up recently.
To be more specific, I'm talking about the people like in Egypt. There are different reporters from Al Jazeera and all these different reporters that were attacked for saying different things about the government. So I believe
Well, I'm not really understanding the relationship between freedom of speech and democracy. So when you're going from a dictatorship into a democracy, or just...
well, I'm saying generally, do you think we should be advocating for human rights, or is it too early, is what I'm getting at? Should there be a democracy first before we...
Well, this is, like what Islam teaches is that there is a transitional period towards any ultimate goal. No matter how good an ultimate goal seems, you have to build up to it, and that's what the teachings of Islam teach us as well, that although we have the Sharia that was revealed through the Prophet Muhammad, peace be on him, but it wasn't revealed in one day, it was slowly and gradually revealed. And so some of those steps, they may seem to be oppressive, but they're actually a necessary means to get to that ultimate goal. And so establishing that Islamic principle, what we have in these different types of countries, sometimes you do need martial law in order to get to a point where the society is organized and stabilized to a point where then you can have a democracy established. You do need to have a dictatorship for some time. You do need to have these different types of transitional periods. And they are wrong if they're used indefinitely. But they are right when they're used as a temporary medicine for a disease that exists in that area. And so this is one of the analogies that one of our Khalifa has given about the establishment of Sharia. He said you can't plant a cherry tree in the middle of a desert. No, it's not the fault of the cherry tree for not blossoming and that's not the fault of it. So in the same way, you can't just take democracy and throw it into the middle of chaos, and then when it fails, say that, democracy doesn't work. Democracy needs an environment. It needs an ecosystem in which it can flourish. And so if it is planted into a desert, into a barren area, then it's actually doing an injustice to democracy and those people themselves. So if there is a need to a certain extent to have martial law temporarily, to have some restrictions on freedom of speech in a place where freedom of speech is actually causing violence and radicalization, there's a need to have a dictatorship temporarily to get to a point of democracy, and that's something that I don't think the teachings of Islam oppose, as long as ultimately the main purpose and ultimately the goal that a person reaches eventually is that principle of democracy and then the freedom that all people have a right to enjoy.
So quickly, are you okay with the Al Jazeera reporters in Egypt being jailed? Or?
Oh, the Al Jazeera reporters?
There's one from Australia, and I forget what the other guys are from.
Do you know what Egyptian, Australian?
What were they reporting?
So I guess, I don't remember the whole story.
During the spring, the Arab Spring, they went over there, and they were from Al Jazeera newspaper. They went over there, and then they were reporting what was the Brotherhood was doing. So there was different powers. They were talking against what are the the extremism they were doing as well.
That's a very fine line to draw, because what Islam teaches is that there is freedom of speech. And what Islam teaches is also exactly the same thing that we have here in the United States, that where a person incites violence and incites hatred, there a person's freedom of speech ends. Because that's actually something that's depriving others of their rights. If you give somebody their rights and as a result of that they're able to deprive others of their rights, then that's something that is not a right that they have any longer. But when a person is reporting on just the facts that are happening in a country, to jail that person, that's something that I don't think is justified according to the teachings of Islam. Perhaps
you even include injustices in it, like they're reporting on injustices.
Yes, of course. I mean, in that situation, I mean, the most that they could have done perhaps is to exile them. But even that would be oppressive because the Prophet Muhammad, peace be on him, never did anything even remotely similar to that. No, he was living in a very sensitive time where he had enemies all around him who were attacking him, and also within his own country, there were people who were transpiring against him, and they were propagating against him. Now, only when they crossed the line and started inciting warfare against him, then he took action. But when they criticized his person, criticized his actions, even insulted his family and things like that, he never took any action against them. So the line that Islam draws is on freedom of speech is on this basic principle that even we acknowledge here in the Western world. Where freedom of speech infringes on the general peace of society, there it has to be stopped. But just because a person is in a politically sensitive situation, their person doesn't have the right to oppress freedom of speech, because there was nobody who was in a more politically sensitive situation than the Prophet Muhammad, peace be on him, when he was outnumbered on all sides in the middle of Arabia, people who were gathering armies and confederacies against him. Even then he never oppressed people's right to freedom of speech, even within his own city. So this is something that Islamically is not justified. Okay, so any other questions that there are, we can address them on an individual level. We've had somewhat of a long session, and I thank you for your patience, and I'll ask Sharif Saab to close out the session.
So, like Imam Rizwan Khan was saying, this concludes our session. We'll have sessions like this throughout the year. I guess as long as ISIS is around, these are great events to have and build a mutual understanding. So I would love to see you guys in the future. And like your mom said, if you guys have any questions for him, just please come up to him. That'll be all. So I'd like to thank you guys again. That's it.